The desert night was vast and silent around him. Robert Oppenheimer stood alone on the wooden porch of the small house at Los Alamos, coat pulled tight against the thin mountain air. He often came outside when the others had gone to sleep. The sky above northern New Mexico stretched black and endless, scattered with stars that looked close enough to touch. He would light a cigarette slowly, watch the match flare for a moment, then let the darkness return. Those quiet minutes belonged only to him. Long before the war reached American shores, Oppenheimer already carried silence inside. Born in New York in 1904 to a family of quiet wealth, he grew up surrounded by art, books, and languages. As a boy, he collected rocks and wrote poetry no one ever saw. At Harvard, then Cambridge, then Göttingen, he moved through the world of physics like someone walking through a library at night, touching volumes gently, careful not to disturb the dust. Colleagues remembered his soft voice, the way he paused before answering, as if every sentence required permission to exist. In the late 1930s, the letters began arriving. European physicists, friends he had studied with, wrote from cities growing darker. Some asked for help leaving. Others simply stopped writing. Oppenheimer read each letter alone, late into the night, then folded it back into its envelope with the same care he once gave to minerals and poems. He did not speak of fear. He spoke even less of anger. He only watched the horizon, as if the answer might appear there. By 1942, the horizon had a name: Los Alamos. General Groves needed a scientific director who could manage brilliant, difficult men without raising his voice. He chose Oppenheimer almost against his own judgment. Too thin, too poetic, too left-leaning, the file said. Yet when they met, Groves felt the calm that radiated from the physicist like cool air from a cave. Something in Oppenheimer's eyes suggested he already understood the weight of what was coming and would not flinch. So the quiet man was given a loud task. He arrived at the mesa with a handful of books and a suitcase. The site was still raw earth and pine. Barracks rose quickly, then laboratories, then fences. Families came, then children, then secrets. Oppenheimer walked the dirt roads every evening, greeting wives pushing prams, nodding to guards who did not yet know what they were guarding. He listened more than he spoke. People found themselves telling him private worries they had not shared with anyone else. He carried those confidences the way he carried equations, lightly, without judgment. In his office he kept a small sign: "Knowledge is not innocent." No one was sure when he had written it. He rarely explained it. At night he read the Bhagavad Gita in the original Sanskrit, moving his lips almost silently. Duty, action without attachment, the stillness at the center of violence. The verses settled over him like dust after a long day. The scientists began to arrive. Fermi with his gentle smile. Beta with his precise questions. Feynman with restless energy barely contained. Oppenheimer greeted each one personally, remembered their children's names, asked about wives left behind in university towns. He turned the isolated mesa into a strange village where people felt, against all reason, at home. They worked from dawn until the stars returned, then talked under those same stars until exhaustion sent them to bed. No one hurried them. Oppenheimer believed the work required time to breathe. Some evenings he drove alone into the desert. He would stop the car, turn off the engine, and sit in perfect silence. The wind moved across the sand like slow water. He thought about chain reactions, about critical mass, about the moment when theory becomes irreversible. He thought about the Gita again, the warrior who must act yet remain unattached to the fruits of action. He wondered, quietly, whether such detachment was possible when the fruit might be the end of cities. Back at the laboratory, the calculations continued. Sheets of paper filled with symbols, then were folded and burned. New sheets appeared the next morning. The rhythm was steady, almost monastic. Coffee at sunrise, seminars at noon, walks at dusk. Children played baseball between the buildings while their fathers decided the shape of a new kind of fire. No one raised their voice. Even arguments unfolded slowly, politely, like chess games played by candlelight. Oppenheimer's health was fragile. He weighed little more than the coat he wore. Cigarettes and coffee kept him upright. Colleagues worried in whispers. He reassured them with a small smile and a softer voice than before. Inside, the questions circled without answer. He wrote letters he never sent. He read poetry aloud to himself when the buildings were empty. He waited as patiently as the desert waited for rain. And so the nights lengthened, and the work deepened, and the man at the center of it all grew quieter still. The stars wheeled overhead. The wind carried pine and distant thunder. Nothing hurried. Everything waited. The mornings at Los Alamos began with the same soft light. Long before the sun cleared the Jemez Mountains, the air carried the scent of coffee and pine. Oppenheimer was usually the first in the technical area. He walked the narrow paths between the huts with his hands clasped behind his back, coat unbuttoned despite the chill, hat tilted slightly forward. He greeted the night guards by name. They had learned not to salute. A nod was enough. Inside the theory building the blackboards waited, covered with yesterday's faint chalk ghosts. He stood before them alone for several minutes, reading the equations as another man might read a letter from home. Then he picked up a fresh piece of chalk and added a line or two, almost apologetically, as if the board had asked him a question in the night and he had finally found the gentlest way to answer. By 7 the others drifted in. They moved quietly, no one slammed doors. Conversations began in low voices and stayed there. Someone poured coffee into thick laboratory mugs. Someone else opened a window so the mountain air could slide across the numbers. Oppenheimer listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, people leaned forward without realizing they were doing it. His words arrived slowly, each one placed like a stone in still water. He had a habit of pausing mid-sentence, eyes half closed, as though listening to something far away. In those pauses the room itself seemed to breathe with him. Then the sentence completed itself, softer than it began, and the discussion moved on, unhurried. He kept odd hours. Colleagues passing his office at 2 in the morning would see the thin blade of light beneath the door and know he was reading. Sometimes physics, sometimes poetry, sometimes nothing at all, simply sitting in the cone of the desk lamp with his hands folded. He slept very little. When exhaustion finally took him, he slept in his clothes on the narrow couch, shoes still on, one arm draped across his eyes. His brother Frank arrived later, bringing a touch of the California coast with him. The two men walked together some evenings along the fenced perimeter, speaking in the shorthand only siblings understand. They did not talk about the work directly. They talked about sailing, about childhood summers, about their mother's paintings. But the silence between their words carried the weight of everything they were not saying. Kitty, his wife, kept a small garden of stubborn flowers near their house. Oppenheimer watered it when she was resting. He bent carefully, coat sleeves rolled high, pouring from a tin can with the same concentration he brought to criticality calculations. The flowers were fragile in that altitude. So was he. Letters from the outside world arrived censored. Whole paragraphs blacked out. He read around the absences the way a musician reads around rests. Sometimes he received news of friends who had not escaped Europe. He folded those letters once, placed them in a drawer, and returned to the blackboards without comment. In the seminars he encouraged disagreement, but gently. A raised voice was rare and always regretted. When younger physicists grew frustrated with a problem, he suggested they walk. The mesa offered many directions. They walked, side by side, boots scuffing red dust, until the problem loosened its grip and began to speak in a quieter tongue. He read the Gita every night now. Not for answers. He no longer believed in simple answers, but for company. The verses moved through him like slow water through stone. He underlined nothing. He simply turned the pages with the same reverence he once reserved for first editions of Rilke. Some nights he climbed to the top of the water tower and sat with his legs dangling over the edge. From there the entire site looked like a small, temporary village lit by soft windows. He could see the guarded gate, the dormitories, the distant glow of the tech area where men were still working. He stayed until the cold drove him down. No one ever joined him there. They understood it was his private vigil. The work itself had settled into a rhythm almost like prayer. Days of calculation, nights of refinement. Small breakthroughs arrived without celebration. Setbacks were met with the same calm nod. Time lost its usual shape. 1943 drifted into 1944 the way one cloud drifts into another. And still he walked the paths every evening, hands behind his back, hat tilted forward. The guards had grown used to the thin figure moving through the dusk. They no longer asked where he was going. They simply watched him disappear between the pines and reappear an hour later, coat dusted with starlight, face unreadable. Inside his chest the questions circled, patient as vultures, patient as stars. He gave them no additional food. He simply let them circle. The mesa held its breath. The work deepened. The man at the center grew quieter still. The winter of 1944 came early to the mesa. Snow fell without sound and stayed for weeks. Footprints filled slowly behind each walker, as though the ground itself were reluctant to remember anyone had passed. Oppenheimer walked anyway. His coat grew a thin rim of frost along the collar. He did not seem to notice. Inside the buildings the heat came from pot-bellied stoves that smelled of pine and coal. People worked in shirt sleeves, windows fogged, breath visible only when they stepped outside for a moment. The blackboards filled faster now. The equations had begun to speak among themselves. Oppenheimer watched them the way a parent watches children who have learned to play without supervision. He still paused in doorways, listening before entering a room. He still greeted every secretary by name. He still remembered which theoretician's wife was expecting, which technician's mother had died back in Ohio. No detail was too small for his quiet attention. In February the implosion idea settled into its final shape. The words lens and tamper and initiator began to appear in conversations the way ordinary words appear in ordinary places. No one congratulated anyone. They simply nodded and returned to their desks. The nod was enough. He began to lose weight again. Kitty watched him across the breakfast table and said nothing. She had learned that silence was sometimes the only useful language between them. At night she listened to him turn the pages of the Gita long after the house was dark. She did not ask what passage he was reading. She already knew. Some evenings he drove down the long switchback road to Santa Fe. He would sit alone in the bar of La Fonda Hotel, nursing one martini for 2 hours, staring at the ice as it melted. People recognized him but left him alone. Even in town he carried the mesa's hush around him like an invisible cloak. When he returned, the guards opened the gate without asking questions. The children of Los Alamos had begun to call him Oppie. They ran to him when they saw him walking. He bent down, hands on knees, and listened seriously to whatever they needed to tell him. A lost kitten, a broken bicycle, a nightmare about loud noises. He answered each one as though it were the only important thing in the world at that moment. Then he straightened, touched the brim of his hat, and continued on his way. In March the first full-scale lens tests were scheduled. He did not attend. He walked instead to the far edge of the reservation where the ponderosa pines grew thick. He stood among them for a long time, listening to the wind move high above. When he came back his shoes were wet with snowmelt and his face was unreadable. The mail brought fewer personal letters now. Most correspondence was official, typed on War Department letterhead. He read each page carefully, signed where required, and placed the folders in neat stacks. Afterward he stood at the window and watched the snow fall again. The flakes were so slow they seemed to hesitate before touching the ground. He began to speak even less. When words were necessary, they arrived stripped of ornament, almost weightless. Colleagues noticed that his hands trembled slightly when he held a cigarette. They pretended not to notice. One night in April he woke suddenly at 3 in the morning. He dressed without turning on the light, walked to the tech area, and stood outside the building where the initiators were being assembled. The guard on duty saw him and said nothing. Oppenheimer stayed perhaps 20 minutes, hands in coat pockets, breath visible in the cold. Then he walked home again. Kitty was awake when he returned. She did not ask where he had been. She simply moved over in the bed so he could lie down fully dressed. He fell asleep almost immediately, one hand resting on her wrist as though checking for a pulse that was not his own. Spring arrived in small, cautious signs. The snow retreated to the shaded places. Mud replaced ice on the paths. The calculations reached a point where no one could remember what life had been like before them. Oppenheimer walked the muddy paths with the same measured stride. His coat was thinner now. His face carried new lines that had not been there a year earlier. The mesa waited. The equations waited. The quiet man at the center waited with them. Nothing hurried. Everything deepened. The snow was almost gone now. Only the highest ridges still carried it, thin white scars against the dark green of the pines. May had come to the mesa with a gentleness that felt almost indecent. Oppenheimer walked the same paths, but slower. His shoes made almost no sound on the softening ground. Sometimes he stopped for no reason anyone else could see, stood perfectly still for a minute or longer, then continued as if nothing had happened. The guards had stopped trying to guess what he was looking at. In the theory seminars the questions had grown quieter too. The loud ones had all been asked. What remained were the small, delicate questions that no one quite knew how to phrase. He listened to them the way a man listens to very distant thunder, head slightly tilted, eyes half closed, waiting to see if the sound would come again. He had begun to repeat certain phrases, almost unconsciously. Patience, patience, he would murmur when a calculation refused to close. Let it breathe, he would say when someone tried to force an answer too quickly. People wrote the phrases down without meaning to. They appeared later in letters home, in margins of notebooks, in children's games. The gadget was taking shape in another building. He rarely went there now. He had seen enough metal and wire. What interested him was the space between the pieces, the silence that would decide everything. He spoke of that silence often, in the softest voice he had ever used. At night the sky was enormous. The Milky Way lay across it like spilled salt. He and Kitty sometimes sat on the porch steps after the children were asleep. They did not speak much. They simply sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same cold air. Once she asked him what he was thinking. He answered after a long pause, "How quiet everything is just before." He still read the Gita, but slower now. Some nights he read the same verse for an hour, turning it over the way a jeweler turns a stone to catch every facet of light. He no longer underlined. He no longer needed to. In June the first full-scale conventional tests were scheduled far out on the reservation. He did not attend those either. He spent the day walking the pond trail, hands behind his back, hat brim low. When the distant explosions came, dull, muffled thuds across 20 miles of empty land, he did not even turn his head. He simply kept walking, one foot after the other, counting steps the way another man might count rosary beads. His sleep had become thinner than paper. He woke often, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floorboards until the patterns in the wood began to move. Then he dressed and went outside. The guards were used to seeing him at any hour. They opened gates without being asked. One morning in late June he stood at the window of his office and watched a small dust devil spin across the parade ground. It lifted nothing heavier than a scrap of paper, turned once, twice, then collapsed into itself. He watched until there was nothing left to watch. Then he turned back to the desk and signed another requisition form with the same careful signature he had used since 1942. The date for Trinity was set, then moved, then set again. No one spoke of it directly anymore. It was simply there, like the mountains, like the fence, like the quiet man who walked the paths every evening and every morning and sometimes in the middle of the night. The mesa held its breath a little longer. The equations held their breath. The man at the center held his, gently, the way one holds a small bird that has forgotten how to fly. Nothing hurried. Everything waited. July crept in. The air turned dry and electric. Even the pines seemed to stand a little straighter, as though listening. Oppenheimer's walks grew longer. He left before sunrise now and returned when the heat was already thick. His coat stayed on a hook inside the house. The sun would have laughed at it. He wore the same light-colored shirt day after day, sleeves rolled high, collar open. The shirt became part of the landscape, like the fence, like the dusty jeeps. People began to speak in half voices even when they were alone. The habit had settled over the mesa the way dust settles over everything else. Children played more quietly. Dogs stopped barking at shadows. He still paused in doorways. He still remembered every name. But when someone asked him a direct question about the test, he answered with the smallest possible nod or the faintest possible shake of the head. Words had become expensive. He spent them carefully. The control bunkers were finished. 10,000 yards of cable lay in the desert like black snakes sunning themselves. The tower rose one slow section at a time. He watched its progress from a distance, hands shaded over his eyes, the way another man watches a sail appear on the horizon. At night he and Kitty sat on the porch again. The sky was so clear the stars looked wet. Once she reached for his hand. He let her take it, but his fingers stayed cool and still. After a while she let go. Neither of them mentioned it again. He read almost nothing now except the same few pages of the Gita. He no longer turned the pages forward. He simply opened the book at random and let the verses find him. Some nights the book stayed closed on his lap while he looked at the darkness between the stars. On the 3rd of July he walked to the very edge of the technical area and stood looking south for a long time. The guard who usually walked that beat waited at a respectful distance. When Oppenheimer finally turned away, the guard saw that his eyes were red, though his face was calm. The 4th passed in ordinary tasks. Signatures. Telephone calls that lasted 30 seconds. A brief visit to the infirmary to see a technician with heat stroke. He moved through the day the way a ghost moves through walls, present, but not entirely there. That night almost no one slept. Windows stayed dark, but behind the curtains people sat dressed, listening to the wind move across the mesa. Oppenheimer walked the roads until 3, then sat on the porch steps with his head in his hands. Kitty watched from the doorway. She did not go to him. The 5th of July was perfectly clear. The temperature climbed and kept climbing. By evening the air itself seemed brittle. He put on the same light shirt, rolled the sleeves once more, and walked to the cafeteria for dinner as though it were any other day. He ate very little. He spoke to no one. Later, when the others had gone to their assigned shelters, he stood alone outside the McDonald ranch house and looked up. The stars were fierce. He lit a cigarette, drew once, then let it burn between his fingers without smoking it again. The ash grew long and finally fell. The desert waited. The tower waited. The quiet man waited with them. Nothing moved. Everything was ready. July 16th began long before sunrise. The sky was still black when the first jeeps left Los Alamos, headlights off, following one another by memory and starlight. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the engines seemed to understand. Oppenheimer rode in the lead car with General Groves. He wore army fatigues that hung loosely on his frame, the sleeves rolled twice. His pork pie hat was in his lap. He looked straight ahead, hands resting on his knees, perfectly still. They reached the control bunker at South 10,000 just after 2 in the morning. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of concrete and coffee. Men moved slowly, speaking only when necessary. He walked the length of the bunker once, touching nothing, simply letting his eyes adjust to the dim red lights. Then he took his place near the instruments, hands in pockets, waiting. Outside, the desert stretched away in every direction, flat and endless. The tower stood a mile and a half high against the stars, a thin black needle holding something no one had ever held before. The wind had died completely. Even the insects were silent. At 3:30 the final checks began. Voices over the radio were calm, almost sleepy. Green. 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 Each word arrived like a pebble dropped into deep water. He stood at the periscope for a long time. The image was small and distant, but he could see the gadget clearly, wrapped in its cables and tape, waiting the way a seed waits inside dark soil. He did not move. His breathing was so shallow it was almost not there. At 5 o'clock the countdown was postponed 20 minutes because of a thin cloud layer. No one complained. They simply waited, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. He stepped outside for a moment. The air was cold enough to raise gooseflesh on his arms. He looked east. The horizon was still perfectly black. He lit a cigarette, took one slow drag, then let it fall and crushed it under his shoe without hurry. Back inside, the final minutes began. The voice on the loudspeaker was steady, almost bored. 10 minutes. 9 minutes. He stood with his back to the wall, eyes closed, hands still in pockets. Some people glanced at him. No one spoke to him. At 2 minutes he opened his eyes and moved to the periscope again. He did not lean forward. He simply looked. The way a man looks at a familiar landscape he knows he will never see the same way again. T-30 seconds. The bunker grew perfectly still. Someone later said you could hear hearts beating. Then he went, wait. He did not count aloud. He simply watched. For one endless second nothing happened. Then the darkness at the base of the tower turned white. Not bright, not yet, just a pure, impossible white that pushed the night away. The light grew, slowly at first, then faster, until the periscope was filled with it. He did not blink. The flash lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then came the colors. Violet, green, orange, colors no one had names for. The light climbed upward, smooth and silent, carrying the shape of something newborn. He stepped back from the periscope. His face was calm. His eyes were wide open. The shock wave arrived 40 seconds later, a soft, heavy push against the bunker walls, like a giant hand pressing gently. Dust drifted from the ceiling. No one moved. Then the sound came, low and rolling, not loud, almost intimate, the sound of the earth clearing its throat after a very long silence. He stood perfectly still for another minute. Then he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "It worked." No one cheered. No one spoke at all. Outside, the cloud rose slowly, gracefully, turning rose and gold as the first edge of real dawn touched it from the east. He watched through the open door, coatless, hands still in pockets, the light of a new sun on his face. The desert was quiet again. Only the cloud moved, climbing higher, spreading, thinning, becoming part of the ordinary morning sky. He lit another cigarette with fingers that did not tremble. He took one slow drag, then let it fall. Everything had changed. Nothing looked different. July 16th continued under a sky that looked ordinary. The cloud had dissolved into the morning haze. The desert floor showed a new scar, black and glassy, but from a distance it looked like nothing at all. Jeeps moved slowly back toward the tower, their tires kicking up thin dust. Oppenheimer stayed at the site for several hours. He walked the perimeter with a small group, speaking little, pointing now and then at something only he seemed to see. His fatigues were covered in fine white powder. He did not brush it off. By noon the heat was unbearable. The men retreated to the ranch house for water and shade. He sat on a wooden crate outside, hat low, eyes on the horizon. Someone offered him a sandwich. He took it without looking, ate half, then set the rest aside for the ants. The drive back to Los Alamos took longer than usual. The road seemed to stretch. In the car he sat with his head against the window, eyes closed but not sleeping. Groves tried to speak once or twice. Oppenheimer answered with single words, then fell silent again. They arrived at the mesa just as the sun was setting. The gate guard stood a little straighter. Word had already spread. People came out of houses to watch the jeeps pass. No one cheered. They simply watched, faces calm and tired. He went straight home. Kitty was waiting on the porch. She did not ask. She simply took his hat, brushed the dust from his shoulders, and led him inside. He sat at the kitchen table while she made coffee. The cup steamed between his hands, untouched. That night he slept for the first time in days. No dreams came. Just deep, empty darkness. The next morning he woke before dawn. The mesa was perfectly quiet. He dressed in his usual clothes, light shirt, rolled sleeves, pork pie hat, and walked the paths as though nothing had changed. The guards nodded. The secretary smiled. The blackboards waited with fresh chalk. But something had shifted. The equations looked different now. They had edges they had not had before. He stood before them longer than usual, touching nothing, simply looking. In the seminar that afternoon he spoke very little. When someone asked about next steps, he paused for a full minute before answering. "Let it settle," he said finally. No one asked for more. Letters began to arrive from Washington. Congratulations in careful handwriting. He read each one once, then placed them in a drawer without reply. That evening he drove alone into the desert again. He stopped at the same spot he always stopped, turned off the engine, and sat in the gathering dark. The wind moved softly across the sand. He thought about the Gita. The verses came unbidden. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He said them aloud, very quietly, to no one. The stars came out one by one. He watched them without moving. After a long time he started the car and drove back. The mesa was waiting. The work was not finished. But the quiet man carried a new silence inside him now, deeper than before. Nothing hurried. Everything had changed. July slipped into August without warning. The mesa baked under the sun. Dust rose from every footstep and hung in the air like a fine veil. Oppenheimer returned to his walks. The paths were drier now, the pines shedding needles that crunched softly under his shoes. He moved slower than before, hands loose at his sides, hat brim pulled low against the glare. People saw him less often in the tech area. He spent more time in his office, door open, staring at papers he did not touch. The telegrams from Washington arrived daily now. Short, precise, demanding updates. He read each one carefully, answered in fewer words each time. The drawer filled with them. He did not look back at the older ones. Hiroshima came on August 6th. The news arrived over secure lines. He stood in the conference room with a small group, listening to the voice on the phone. No one spoke afterward. He walked home alone, earlier than usual. Kitty was in the garden. She looked up as he approached, saw his face, and went back to her flowers without a word. That night he did not sleep. He sat on the porch until dawn, watching the stars fade one by one. The air was warm for once. He lit cigarette after cigarette, letting most of them burn untouched. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The news came the same way. He received it in his office, alone. After hanging up the phone, he sat perfectly still for a long time. Then he stood, put on his hat, and walked out into the heat. The celebrations began that evening. People gathered in the streets, laughing, clapping shoulders. The war was ending. He moved among them like a shadow, nodding when spoken to, smiling when required. Someone pressed a glass into his hand. He held it without drinking. Later, when the crowds thinned, he walked to the edge of the mesa and stood looking east. The horizon was flat and empty. The wind carried faint music from the dormitories. He stayed until the music stopped. The next morning he woke with the sun. The mesa was quiet again. He dressed, rolled his sleeves, and went to the blackboards. The equations were still there, unchanged. He erased one slowly, watching the chalk dust fall. Letters began arriving from outside. Some congratulated. Some asked questions he could not answer. He replied to none. In September the first reporters came. He met them in his office, voice soft, words chosen with care. He spoke of science, not consequences. When they left, he closed the door and sat alone until dark. That evening he drove into the desert once more. The spot was the same. The engine ticked as it cooled. He thought about the Gita again. The verses echoed without comfort. The stars were sharp overhead. He watched them turn. After a while he started the car and returned. The work was finished. The quiet man carried it inside him now, heavier than before. Nothing ended. Everything lingered. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed. One morning the cottonwoods along the dry arroyo had turned gold overnight. The light itself felt thinner, as if the sun had begun to forget the way to the mesa. Oppenheimer walked less now. When he did walk, his steps were shorter, more careful, as though the ground might give way. His coat came back from the closet. The sleeves hung empty past his wrists. The laboratories began to empty. Scientists packed books into wooden crates, labeled them with neat black ink. Children asked when they would go home. No one had a clear answer. He spent hours in his office with the door closed. Papers lay untouched on the desk. Sometimes he simply sat, hands folded, staring at the small sign he had written years earlier. Knowledge is not innocent. He read it over and over, as if it were written in a language he had once known well. In October the first families left. Jeeps pulled away from the dormitories at dawn, raising long plumes of dust. He stood on the porch and watched each one disappear down the switchback road. He did not wave. Kitty packed slowly. She wrapped dishes in newspaper, folded clothes into suitcases that still smelled faintly of pine. He helped when asked, carried boxes to the porch, then stood looking at the mountains until someone called him back. On his last evening at Los Alamos he walked the entire site alone. The buildings were dark. The fences had begun to sag. He passed the cafeteria, the theater, the pond where the children once sailed makeshift boats. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. At the tech area he stopped outside the building where the calculations had lived. The windows were boarded. He placed one hand flat against the wall for a moment, feeling the faint warmth the sun had left there. Then he moved on. He ended at the far edge of the mesa, where the ground dropped away into darkness. The wind was cold. He lit a cigarette, cupped the match carefully, and watched the flame die. Below him the desert stretched black and endless. Above him the stars were the same stars that had watched everything. He stayed a long time. No one came looking for him. When he finally walked back, the house was almost empty. Kitty had left one lamp burning. He turned it off and sat in the dark until the moving truck arrived at dawn. They drove away just after sunrise. He did not look back. The mesa settled into silence. The gates closed. The dust began to cover the footprints. The quiet man carried the mesa with him now, folded small and heavy inside his coat. Nothing moved. Everything stayed. They returned to Berkeley in late October. The California air smelled of eucalyptus and sea salt. The house on Eagle Hill was larger than anything on the mesa, with wide windows that let in the fog. Oppenheimer stood in the empty living room for a long time, hands in pockets, looking at the bare walls. Kitty unpacked slowly. The children ran through the rooms, their voices echoing off the wood floors. He watched them from the doorway, hat still on, a small smile at the corners of his mouth. When they asked about the desert, he answered with single words, hot, quiet, gone. The university welcomed him back with quiet ceremonies. Colleagues shook his hand carefully, as though he might break. Students stared from a distance. He taught his first class in a lecture hall that felt too large. His voice was softer than they remembered. He paused often, looking out the window at the bay. Letters continued to arrive. Some from Washington, some from strangers. He read them at breakfast, folded them neatly, and placed them in a drawer that was beginning to fill again. Replies were short when he wrote them at all. In November he traveled to Washington for the first hearings. The rooms were wood-paneled and dim. Men in suits asked questions he had already asked himself. He answered calmly, hands folded on the table, eyes steady. When they praised him, he nodded without smiling. Back home he walked the hills behind the house. The paths were steep and foggy. He moved slowly, stopping often to catch his breath. The eucalyptus leaves crunched underfoot, releasing their sharp scent. He thought about the mesa, about the tower, about the light that had filled the periscope. At night he sat in his study with the Gita open on his desk. He read the same verses, turning them over in his mind like stones smoothed by water. Sometimes Kitty joined him, sitting in the armchair with a book of her own. They did not speak. The fog pressed against the windows. In December the first articles appeared. "Father of the bomb," they called him. He read the headline once, then set the paper aside. Friends called to congratulate or console. He listened politely, said little, hung up gently. The new year came quietly. 1946 dawned with rain. He stood at the window watching it fall on the bay. The water was gray and still. He began to lose weight again. Cigarettes and coffee replaced meals. Kitty watched without comment. She had learned that some silences could not be filled. One evening in January he drove alone to the coast. The beach was empty. He walked to the water's edge, shoes sinking in the wet sand. Waves broke softly, one after another. He stood there until dark, then drove back. The house was waiting. The children were asleep. The quiet man carried the sea with him now, added to the desert inside his coat. Nothing faded. Everything accumulated. Spring returned to Berkeley in soft waves. The fog lifted earlier each day. Flowers appeared in the garden without anyone planting them. Oppenheimer watched from the study window, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. The university routines settled around him like old clothes. Lectures at 10. Office hours at 2. Students came with questions about quantum fields, about relativity, about things that could be calculated and forgotten. He answered slowly, his voice a murmur in the large room. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence, eyes distant, then continued as if no time had passed. Kitty filled the house with music. Bach in the mornings. Mozart at dusk. He listened from his chair, hands folded, not moving. The notes filled the spaces where words used to be. In April he traveled east again. The train crossed the desert at night. He sat by the window, watching the same stars he had watched from the mesa. They looked smaller now. Washington was gray and formal. The hearings continued in the same wood-paneled rooms. Men asked about loyalties, about old friends, about conversations half-remembered. He answered without raising his voice, hands steady on the table. When they doubted, he simply repeated what he had said, softer the second time. Back home the garden had bloomed fully. He walked among the flowers in the evening, touching petals lightly, as though they might dissolve. Kitty joined him sometimes. They spoke of small things, the children's school, the neighbor's dog, the price of coffee. Letters arrived less often now. When they did, he read them once and placed them in the growing drawer. No replies were needed. In May he drove to the coast again. The beach was the same. The waves broke in the same rhythm. He stood at the water's edge, shoes off, letting the cold foam touch his feet. The sand shifted under him, slow and patient. That night he opened the Gita for the first time in weeks. The verses were familiar, worn smooth from handling. He read them aloud, very quietly, to the empty room. The fog rolled in after midnight. He watched it cover the bay. Everything blurred at the edges. The quiet man carried more now, desert, sea, fog. All folded inside, heavy but invisible. Nothing released. Everything held. Summer settled over Berkeley like a warm blanket. The bay sparkled under clear skies. Sailboats dotted the water, small and distant. Oppenheimer watched them from the hill, hands in pockets, hat tilted back. The routines deepened. Lectures flowed one into another. Students came and went, their questions growing more tentative. He answered with fewer words, more pauses. Sometimes he simply nodded, letting the silence teach. Kitty planted herbs in window boxes. Basil, rosemary, thyme. He watered them in the evenings, pouring slowly, watching the soil darken. The scents lingered on his fingers long after. In July he traveled to New York. The city felt too loud after the hills. Meetings in tall buildings, rooms with heavy curtains. Men asked about the future, about control, about regrets. He spoke softly, eyes on the floor, hands folded tight. Back home the herbs had grown taller. He clipped a few leaves for dinner, crushed them between his fingers, breathed the sharp green smell. Kitty cooked without recipes. They ate in silence, the bay turning pink outside the window. Letters slowed to a trickle. When one arrived, he left it unopened on the desk for days. Eventually he read it, folded it back, added it to the drawer. In August he drove to the coast once more. The beach was crowded with families. He walked far from them, where the sand met rocks. Waves broke steadily, foam hissing on the pebbles. He sat on a driftwood log, watching the horizon until the light failed. That night the fog was thick. He opened the Gita in the study, read a single verse over and over. The words circled without landing. The children grew taller. Their voices changed. He listened to them play in the garden, the sounds distant and familiar. The quiet man carried the seasons now, desert heat, sea cold, fog gray. All layered inside, pressing gently. Nothing shifted. Everything deepened. Autumn returned again. The eucalyptus leaves turned bronze and began to fall. They drifted across the paths like slow brown, very slow thoughts. Oppenheimer walked the hills behind the house every morning now. The fog came and went. Some days he disappeared into it completely. Kitty watched from the kitchen window, coffee cooling in her hand. The university had become a habit. He moved through corridors that smelled of chalk and old wood. Students greeted him with quiet respect. He nodded, hat in hand, voice barely above the rustle of leaves. In October the hearings resumed. Washington again. The same rooms, the same faces, the same questions asked in slightly different order. He answered with the same calm, the same soft pauses. When they pressed, he simply repeated, softer still. Back in Berkeley the garden slept under early rain. He stood at the window watching water run down the glass. The drops merged, separated, merged again. Letters almost stopped. The drawer was full. He no longer opened it. At night he read nothing. The Gita stayed closed on the desk. He sat in the dark study, hands folded, listening to the house breathe. The children spoke of college now. Their voices carried new distances. He listened from the doorway, smiling faintly, saying little. One evening in November he drove to the coast alone. The beach was empty, the sky low and gray. He walked until the sand turned hard and wet. Waves came in, retreated, came in again. He stood there until the cold reached his bones. On the way home the fog closed behind him. The road disappeared. He drove slowly, headlights catching nothing but mist. The house was dark when he arrived. Kitty had left one lamp burning. He turned it off and sat in the silence. The quiet man carried everything now. Desert, sea, fog, rain. All folded inside, heavier, softer. Nothing moved. Everything waited. Winter arrived soft and gray. Rain fell for days without pause. The bay disappeared behind curtains of water. Oppenheimer's walks grew shorter. He left the house after breakfast, returned before lunch, coat dripping on the mat. Kitty hung it by the stove without comment. The university slowed. Fewer students in the corridors. Fewer questions. He taught from notes he no longer needed, voice low, almost a murmur against the rain. In January the hearings moved to closed session. Washington again. Long tables, no windows, cigarette smoke hanging under the lights. They asked about conversations from 20 years earlier. He answered slowly, choosing each word the way a man chooses stones to cross a stream. Back home the rain continued. He stood at the study window watching it slide down the glass in perfect straight lines. Sometimes he lifted one hand and followed a drop with his finger, from top to bottom, until it vanished. Kitty played no music now. The house was quiet except for the rain on the roof and the occasional creak of old wood settling. The children came home for the holidays. Their voices filled the rooms for a week. He listened from his chair, eyes half closed, small smile in place. When they left again, the silence felt deeper than before. Letters had stopped completely. The drawer stayed closed. At night he sometimes opened the Gita, but only to rest his hand on the cover. He no longer needed to read. The verses lived inside him now, quiet and familiar. One evening in February he drove to the coast through heavy rain. The road was almost empty. Wipers moved back and forth, back and forth. He parked at the overlook and sat in the car with the engine off. The sea was invisible, only sound, steady, patient, endless. He stayed until the windows fogged completely. Then he wiped a small circle with his sleeve and looked out at nothing. On the way home he stopped the car on a narrow bridge and watched the creek below, swollen and brown, carrying branches and leaves downstream. He watched for a long time. The house was warm when he returned. Kitty had left soup on the stove. He ate half a bowl standing at the counter, then went to the study and sat in the dark. The quiet man carried the rain now. It joined everything else inside the coat. Nothing hurried. Everything soaked through. Spring crept back to Berkeley. The fog thinned. Sunlight touched the bay earlier each day, turning the water silver. Oppenheimer resumed his longer walks. He left the house at dawn, coat unbuttoned, hat in hand. The hills smelled of wet earth and new grass. He moved steadily, pausing at the top to look down at the house below. The university hummed with students again. They filled the lecture halls, notebooks open, eyes attentive. He spoke from memory now, voice soft as the spring wind. Pauses grew longer. Sometimes he let them stretch until the class shifted in their seats. Kitty replanted the window boxes. Lavender this time. He watered them at dusk, the purple scent rising in the cooling air. They sat on the porch afterward, watching the lights come on across the bay. In April the hearings ended. Washington for the last time. The rooms felt emptier. They asked no new questions. He gave no new answers. On the train home he sat by the window, watching the desert pass once more. Back in Berkeley the lavender bloomed. He clipped a sprig and left it on his desk. The scent lingered through the day. The drawer stayed closed. No more letters came. At night he opened the Gita occasionally. The verses felt distant, like stars seen through haze. He closed the book gently, sat in the chair with hands folded. The children wrote from school. Their letters were short, full of ordinary news. He read them aloud to Kitty, voice steady and low. One evening in May he drove to the coast. The beach was soft underfoot. Waves came in gently, retreating without hurry. He walked until the sun touched the water, then sat on the sand watching colors change. On the way home the road was clear. No fog. He drove slowly anyway. The house smelled of lavender when he arrived. Kitty had left the window open. He closed it softly and went to bed. The quiet man carried the spring now. It joined the rest inside, light and fleeting. Nothing bloomed. Everything persisted. Winter came slowly that year. The rain turned to light frost in the mornings. The bay looked colder, the water darker under gray skies. Oppenheimer walked the hills with his coat buttoned high. His breath made small clouds that lingered a moment before dissolving. He stopped often now, leaning on a tree or a fence, watching the fog roll in from the west. The world blurred at the edges, then cleared, blurred again. Kitty kept the house warmer than before. She lit the fireplace in the evenings, sat with her knitting, glancing up when he entered. He hung his coat, poured coffee, sat across from her without speaking. The fire crackled softly, filling the room. The university was quiet. Winter break emptied the halls. He went to his office anyway, sat at the desk, looked at papers he had looked at many times. Sometimes he wrote a single line in his notebook, then closed it again. In January a letter arrived from an old colleague. He read it standing at the door, then placed it unopened in the drawer. The drawer was full now. He pushed it shut with more force than needed. The lavender pots stood empty on the windowsill. Kitty dusted them occasionally, but left them there. At night he sat in the study longer. The Gita remained closed. He folded his hands and watched the flames through the half-open door. The children called sometimes. Their voices were distant over the line. He held the receiver carefully, answered questions he had heard before. When they hung up, the silence returned deeper. One evening in February he drove to the coast despite the cold. The road was slick with frost. He parked and walked to the overlook, hands deep in pockets. The sea was rough below, waves crashing white against black rocks. He stood until his fingers numbed, then returned to the car. The drive home was careful. The frost had thickened. He kept the speed low, eyes on the road. The house was warm. Kitty had left the fire burning low. He sat beside it, hands outstretched, feeling the heat slowly return. The quiet man carried winter now. Frost, empty lines, closed drawers. All folded inside, cold and still. Nothing stirred. Everything rested. Years had begun to move like the slow turning of a very large wheel. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, they arrived and left without announcement. The eucalyptus kept shedding leaves that no one raked. The bay kept changing color with the light. The house on Eagle Hill kept its quiet the way a shell keeps the sound of the sea. Oppenheimer walked every morning when the weather allowed. Some days only to the end of the garden and back. Some days all the way to the ridge where the view opened wide and the wind pressed against his coat like a hand trying to stop him. He never resisted. He simply stood until the wind grew tired and let him go. Kitty had stopped planting anything new. The window boxes stayed empty, the lavender long gone. She moved through the rooms with the same measured steps she had used on the mesa 20 years earlier. They spoke less now, but the silences between them were comfortable, worn smooth by decades of use. The university had become a place he visited rather than inhabited. He kept an office with his name on the door, a desk, a chair, a small stack of letters he never answered. Students still came occasionally, knocked softly, asked questions about wave functions or ethics or the old days. He answered in sentences that grew shorter every year, voice so low they leaned forward to hear. When the question was finished, he nodded once and looked out the window until they understood it was time to leave. Evenings were spent in the study. The Gita lay closed on the desk beside a single photograph. The mesa at sunset, 1944, the buildings small and temporary against the enormous land. He rarely touched the book now. He simply rested his hand on its cover from time to time, the way another man might rest a hand on a sleeping child's head. The children had children of their own. They visited once or twice a year, brought noise and photographs and brief bursts of life. He greeted them at the door with the same small smile, listened to their stories, held the grandchildren on his knee for a few minutes, then returned to his chair. When they left, the house folded back into its old hush like a letter returned to its envelope. Some nights he woke long before dawn. He dressed quietly, took the car, and drove the familiar road to the coast. The beach was always empty at that hour. He walked to the water's edge, shoes in hand, and stood while the waves rearranged the sand around his feet. The horizon was a thin pale line that grew slowly brighter. He watched it the way he had once watched the horizon in New Mexico, waiting for something that had already happened. On the drive home the sun rose behind him. He never looked in the rearview mirror. The quiet man carried everything now. Desert dawn, mesa dusk, sea fog, bay light, empty window boxes, unopened letters, the faint smell of long-dead lavender, the sound of waves that never quite reached the house. All of it folded inside the same thin coat, weightless and unbearable at the same time. Nothing hurried. Nothing ended. Everything simply continued, slowly, patiently, the way night continues long after the stars have gone out. Time had lost its edges. Days arrived, lingered, left without leaving marks. The eucalyptus kept dropping leaves that drifted across the path and settled in corners no one swept. The bay kept its quiet breathing, in and out, the way a sleeper breathes long after dreams have stopped. Oppenheimer still walked. Some mornings only to the mailbox and back. Some mornings to the ridge where the wind pressed gently against his chest, reminding him he was still there. He never hurried. He never arrived anywhere in particular. He simply walked until the walking felt finished, then turned and walked home again. Kitty moved through the house like a shadow that had learned the shape of every room. She made coffee, poured 2 cups, drank one, left the other to cool on the table. She no longer asked if he wanted anything. She simply left things where he would find them, the way the tide leaves shells on the sand. The study had become the center of everything. The Gita still lay closed beside the photograph of the mesa. The drawer was still full. Nothing had been added, nothing removed. He sat in the same chair every evening, hands folded, eyes resting on nothing in particular. Sometimes he stayed until the first pale light of morning touched the window. The children's visits had grown rare. When they came, they spoke softly as though afraid of waking something. They brought photographs of grandchildren he recognized only from previous photographs. He held the pictures carefully, studied them for a long time, then handed them back with a small nod. After they left, the house returned to its deeper quiet, the quiet that had always been waiting underneath. Some nights he still drove to the coast. The road was familiar now, every curve known by heart. He parked in the same place, walked the same narrow path to the beach. The waves still came in, retreated, came in again. He stood at the edge and let the cold water touch his feet, let the wind push against his coat, let the darkness settle over everything. He stayed until the stars began to fade, then walked back to the car without looking behind him. On the drive home the sky slowly lightened. He kept the windows closed, the radio off, the silence complete. The house was always dark when he returned. Kitty slept. He moved through the rooms without turning on lights, sat in the study chair, hands in lap, and waited for the day to begin again. The quiet man carried it all now. Desert nights, mesa dawns, sea fog, bay light, empty cups, unopened letters, the faint creak of the house settling, the soft sound of Kitty breathing in the next room, the slow turning of seasons that no longer needed names. All of it folded inside the same thin frame, weightless, endless, patient. Nothing hurried. Nothing ended. Everything simply was and was and was. The years no longer announced themselves. They simply passed overhead like very high clouds that never quite cast a shadow. Oppenheimer still rose early. He dressed in the same clothes he had worn for decades, light shirt, dark trousers, the thin coat that had once been new. Some mornings he walked to the end of the garden and stood among the unraked leaves. Some mornings he did not leave the house at all. He simply stood at the window, hands behind his back, watching the fog move across the bay the way it had always moved, slowly, patiently, without purpose. Kitty moved through the rooms in slippers that made no sound. She brewed coffee for 2, drank 1 cup, left the other on the table until it cooled completely. She no longer asked if he wanted breakfast. She simply placed a plate where he would see it, then returned to her chair by the window. The study had become the stillest place in the house. The Gita rested on the desk, closed, its cover softened by years of quiet touch. Beside it the old photograph of the mesa at sunset, colors faded almost to gray. He sat in the leather chair every evening, hands folded in his lap, eyes resting on nothing. Sometimes he stayed until the first pale light returned. Sometimes he stayed longer. The children had stopped visiting. They wrote occasionally, short letters full of ordinary news. He read them once, slowly, then placed them in the drawer that had never been emptied. The drawer accepted them without protest. Some nights he still drove to the coast. The road was the same, the curves familiar under the wheels. He parked in the same place, walked the same narrow path to the beach. The waves still came in, retreated, came in again. He stood at the edge and let the cold water touch his shoes, let the wind press against his coat, let the darkness settle over everything until there was no difference between sea and sky. He stayed longer each time. When he finally turned back, the sand had erased his footprints already. On the drive home the stars were faint. He kept the windows closed, the radio off, the silence complete. The house was always dark when he returned. Kitty slept. He moved through the rooms without light, sat in the study chair, hands in lap, and waited for morning to begin again. The quiet man carried everything now. Desert dawn, mesa dusk, sea fog, bay light, empty cups, unopened letters, the soft creak of floorboards, the faint smell of coffee gone cold, the slow breathing of the house itself. All of it folded inside the same thin frame, weightless, endless, patient. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to happen. Everything simply continued, the way the tide continues long after the moon has moved on. The seasons no longer needed names. They simply arrived, stayed a while, left without farewell. The eucalyptus kept its rhythm, leaves falling one by one, gathering in quiet piles that the wind moved when it remembered. The bay kept its eternal inhale and exhale, water rising, falling, rising again, the sound faint through the windows that stayed closed more often now. Oppenheimer rose at the same hour, or what felt like the same hour. He dressed slowly, the same shirt, the same trousers, the coat that hung loose on his frame like an old friend who had stayed too long. Some mornings he stepped outside and stood on the porch, hands loose at his sides, eyes resting on the fog that covered everything in soft gray. Some mornings he turned back inside before the door fully closed. He simply existed in the space between inside and out, waiting for nothing in particular. Kitty prepared tea now instead of coffee. She poured 2 cups, drank one slowly, left the other to cool on the table until the steam was gone. She no longer spoke of the day ahead. She simply sat in her chair, book open but unread, listening to the house's small sounds, the tick of the clock, the creak of wood, the distant hum of the world beyond the hill. The study had become timeless. The Gita rested closed, its pages remembering everything he no longer needed to remember. Beside it the faded photograph of the mesa, the sunset now barely a hint of color. He sat in the chair every evening, hands folded loosely, eyes half closed, breathing in time with the room itself. Sometimes the evenings stretched into night without him noticing. Sometimes the night stretched into dawn. The children's letters had stopped. The drawer held everything it needed to hold. He never opened it. It simply was there, like the chair, like the desk, like the quiet that filled every corner. Some nights he thought of driving to the coast. The road was still there in his mind, every curve clear. But he stayed in the chair, letting the waves come to him in memory. In, out, the sound faint but persistent. He let the wind press against the windows instead of his coat, let the darkness settle over the room until there was no difference between eyes open and eyes closed. The house waited with him. Kitty slept. He sat in the study, hands in lap, and let the quiet continue. The quiet man carried nothing new now. Desert dawn, mesa dusk, sea fog, bay light, empty cups, unopened letters, the soft creak of the house, the faint smell of tea gone cold, the slow turning of days into nights into days. All of it folded inside, weightless, endless, still. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to happen. Everything simply continued, the way silence continues long after the last word has been spoken. There was no longer a clear line between day and night. Light came, light went. Fog arrived, fog left. The eucalyptus leaves kept falling, one by one, without hurry, without sound. Oppenheimer still rose, or believed he rose. The same shirt, the same trousers, the coat that no longer needed to be worn because the chill was inside now. He moved through the rooms the way a shadow moves across a wall when the sun is very low. Slowly, without purpose, without end. Kitty no longer prepared 2 cups. She prepared one, drank half, left the rest to cool on the table until it was forgotten. She sat in her chair by the window, hands resting in her lap, eyes on nothing in particular. The house breathed around her, slow and steady. The study had become the entire world. The Gita rested closed. The photograph of the mesa had faded to the color of old ash. He sat in the chair, or stood beside the window, or simply existed in the space between sitting and standing. Time no longer passed. It simply circled, gently, like dust motes in a shaft of weak light. No one came to the door. No letters arrived. The telephone stayed silent. The drawer stayed closed. Everything that needed to be kept had already been kept. Some nights, or some days, he thought he heard the sea. The sound was very far away, yet very close, inside the room, inside the quiet. Waves came in, retreated, came in again. He listened without moving. He listened without needing to listen. The coast was no longer a place to drive to. It had moved inside the house, inside the chair, inside the slow rise and fall of breath. The desert was there too, and the mesa, and the faint glow on a distant horizon that had once been dawn and might still be dawn somewhere. Kitty slept, or sat awake, or simply was. The house held them both the way night holds two small candles that have almost burned down. The quiet man carried nothing now. Nothing at all. Desert, sea, mesa, fog, light, silence, breath. Everything had dissolved into the same soft weightlessness. There was no longer any difference. Between sitting and not sitting, between remembering and not remembering, between being and not being. Everything simply continued, the way silence continues, long after the last star has gone out, and the darkness itself has forgotten its own name.